Hello YouTube, and welcome back to another video from me, your host Logan Albright. And some of you have been asking for a bookshelf tour. I haven't done a bookshelf tour in a long time, so I did a poll on my community page to ask what type of books you'd like me to talk about, and you said you wanted me to talk about fiction, which I'm happy to do. I will also probably do bookshelf tours of the other two categories I listed, which were occult and metaphysical books and books on libertarianism and political philosophy, because I also have a large collection of both of those topics, but I'll do those later. I'll start with the fiction ones. And what I've done here is, first of all, I've limited my selection to 50 books because I don't really have more than 50 books that I want to talk about, and because that'll be a plenty long video and no one's going to want to watch more than that. So we're going to talk about 50 books. The other thing that I've done is I have, rather than going around to the bookshelf and pulling them off and talking about them one by one, I have pre-removed them from the bookshelf and sat them in a pile next to me here because I am very low-tech and lazy, and I just record this on my iPhone with no external microphone or anything, and like filming it with an actual iPhone on a bookshelf is very difficult. So I want a stationary camera, and I can just hold up the books in front of them, and it should be easy. So I hope that's okay with everybody. I won't actually be going through the shelves themselves. I had to collect these books from a wide variety of different shelves around my apartment and stack them up. And we'll go through, and I have a variety of genres here. There's a lot of classics, there's a lot of fantasy, there's a lot of horror, there's a lot of short stories, things that I like to read. So let's get started. I think I'm going to start with a pile that I have here of mainly hardcovers that are sort of classics, and we'll go through those. The first one on the pile, and I think I should say ahead of time, I think I've done videos on almost all of these books because I've had this channel for like 5 years, and I've reviewed basically every fiction book that I've read in the last 5 years. So you probably will have seen videos of most of these before, so I'll go through them quickly. And if you're interested more, you can to learn more, you can go through the channel and find the videos of all these books in the past. But I'm just going to go through them, and we'll see what I have to say. First copy I have is Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, which was sort of my reintroduction to Russian literature after I did a university degree in Russian and East European studies about 20 years ago. And I never really liked any of the stuff we read, apart from the stuff written by Gogol, because I found it depressing and very nihilistic. Gogol's I thought was funny and enjoyed. And he only wrote one novel, and it was unfinished at the time of his death, and it was called Dead Souls. And I picked it up fairly recently and read it and really, really loved it. And so it kind of got me back into reading more Russian literature, and I started reading like Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, and I have some other stuff on my list that I want to read. So I appreciate this, and this is a weird, like, I can't figure out the publisher on this. It's a very strange, like, private publisher that I found in a used bookstore. So Dead Souls, really liked. It was very cool. And not all of these books are going to be books that I love. These are just books that I think are worth talking about for whatever reason. And sometimes that'll be because of the edition of the book. Sometimes that'll be because of a biographical note about the book. Or sometimes it'll be about the content of the book. Next up, I have a few Library of America editions. I love the Library of America, and I wish there was like a comparable Library of Britain, because I like a lot of British authors. And it's nice to get like good quality hardcovers of American authors that are collected and have lots of notes in the back, lots of kind of biographical details and explanatory notes of older works that, like, some of the references will pass by you if you're a modern reader. So I love those, and I have a lot of them. And I just pulled out a few of my favorites that are fiction. The first of which is the first collected works of Washington Irving. I think there's maybe 3 volumes of Irving in the Library of America. This is the only one I have. And it is History, Tales, and Sketches. It includes the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, History of New York, Salmagundi, and Letters of Jonathan Oldstyle Gentleman. The sketchbook contains his most famous stories, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Very funny writer, one of the first American writers to make his living solely on his literary works. Very influential among Americans, and one of those category of kind of slightly spooky New England writers that I really love from the 19th century, or in this case, the 18th century. A lot of fun. I really like Irving and recommend you read him if you have not. Next up, similar author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, again, a spooky New England writer. This is one of 2 volumes of him that exist in the Library of America, the only one that I own. Collected novels. The other one is his short stories, which I've read in a separate edition and like a lot. I need to get that Library of America, but I don't have it right now. It's Fanshawe, The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, The Blithedale Romance, and The Marble Fawn. I know The Scarlet Letter is one of those books that people read in high school and hate. I really love it. I think The Scarlet Letter is great. Fanshawe is a lot of fun adventure and very underrated, I think. House of the Seven Gables is a great Gothic novel. And then The Blithedale Romance and The Marble Fawn I enjoyed, but not quite as much as the other two. But I really like Hawthorne as a writer. Again, it's a little bit difficult because it's older prose, but I think his stuff is well worth reading. And if you weren't forced to read it in high school, you might pick it up and really enjoy it. Next up is A Library of America, a more recent one of the novels and stories of Shirley Jackson. This is the first of two editions of her that they have, and again, the only one that I own. It contains The Lottery, The Haunting of Hill House, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and other stories and sketches. The Lottery is a great classic short story. Some of her other short stories are among my favorites. I love Shirley Jackson. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is a fantastic novel. That was her last novel, and it's really, really excellent. I don't care for The Haunting of Hill House as much as everyone else does. A lot of people really, really love that one. I think it's fine, but I like her other work better. And there's some other recent work that I've read, or recently read by me, of her work that I've read, and I like just as much. Like I talked about recently, the novel The Sundial, which is one of my favorite works of hers. So Shirley Jackson's great. I saw one person complain about this entering the Library of America because they thought she wasn't prestigious enough to warrant it, and I think that's ridiculous because she's a great writer. Another New England writer, or actually New York in this case, so not quite New England, is Herman Melville, and Herman Melville is one of my very favorite writers. He has 3 volumes in the Library of America, and this is the third and last one. I have all 3 of them, and the reason I picked this one to talk about is because it contains his weirdest work. Like the first volume contains kind of his travelogue, adventure stories, which are not that interesting. The second volume contains Moby Dick, which is fantastic. I've read it twice. I love it. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. But this one contains, to me, his most interesting work. It contains Pierre, Israel Potter, The Piazza Tales, The Confidence Man, Uncollected Prose, and Billy Budd. And Pierre is the strangest book I've ever read. It's a really bizarre and bitter follow-up to his commercial failure of Moby Dick. It's indescribable. It's really weird. I recommend you read it. It's kind of like parodying 18th century romances, but it's really super dark and gets crazy at the end. It's like a pastoral boy who ends up going to the big city, and there's this like unhinged rant against publishers and the publishing industry in the middle of it because Melville was so angry that Moby Dick didn't sell. That's great. The Confidence Man is also incredibly strange and hard to understand. It's just like amazing how experimental this guy went after Moby Dick. I love it. And then the Piazza Tales contain some of my favorite short stories, like this beautifully written prose. Wonderful stuff. I love all Melville's work. Highly recommended. All right, where are we going now? Oh, okay. Let's go. This is some more hardcovers. This is my slipcover leather-bound edition of Lord of the Rings. I've shown this on the channel a bunch. I don't need to say very much about it, but it's well-loved. I've read it many times. It contains a beautiful fold-out map in the back. It's all 3 novels in one volume. A little bit unwieldy to read, but I love how beautiful it is, and it mimics that Red Book of Westmarch, which Tolkien supposedly found the manuscript for Lord of the Rings in and translated it. So I really love this edition. It's pretty old at this point. I think it's probably at least 20 years old, probably more than that. But I really like this edition. I know there's a lot of new editions out there I should probably look into, but this one has served me well, and it's still holding up well, despite the fact that I've read it like 5 or 6 times in this edition. So that's great. Speaking of fantasy, we have the first volume of the recently published Elric Saga, Elric of Melniboné, Volume 1 by Michael Moorcock. I recently discovered Elric. He was one of the kind of twin forefathers of modern fantasy with Tolkien. His is much more Conan the Barbarian, Dungeons and Dragons kind of feeling. And I love the Elric stories. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'm currently reading the second volume and I'm going to publish a video about that soon. So I don't want to overlap on that too much. But the Elric stories are tons of fun and essential to the growth of modern fantasy and to the Dungeons and Dragons game. It's a lot of fun. Another fantasy novel that is among my favorite novels ever written is the Gormangas Trilogy by Mervyn Peake in this beautiful hardcover edition with illustrations by the author. Again, I discovered this a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, something like that. And I've read it twice. It's one of my favorite books. Mervyn Peake was extremely strange and wrote like kind of during the Second World War. And it's all about these extremely weird characters in this giant castle/city that's sort of one enclosed thing. And their bizarre rituals that have accumulated over time. It's a little bit of his critique of the British monarchy, I think. But it's so imaginative and weird and awesome, and it's got a really thrilling narrative. The only thing bad I'll have to say about it is the third volume. Mervyn Peake had some kind of mental problems. He had a degenerative mental disease towards the end of his life, and it really shows in that third novel, which is very different than the first two and is not nearly as good. But the first two novels are among my favorite things ever written. Gormangas Trilogy by Mervyn Peake is amazing. Next up, we have the collected works of William Shakespeare in a one-volume leather-bound edition, which I picked up at a used bookstore. I am not the biggest Shakespeare fan in the world. I'm more of a Milton guy. Always been more of a Milton guy. But I feel like Shakespeare is so integral to the Western canon that you can't not read him. And so I've been very slowly working my way through this. I still have a long way to go. There's a lot of it I haven't read. But I wanted to show it just because I think it's important for people who want to be educated and literary and knowledgeable about literary things to have some William Shakespeare on their shelf. And this is a nice one-volume leather-bound edition from Barnes & Noble books. And I actually have a lot of these Barnes & Noble leather-bound classics, which I'm going to talk about very shortly. So far I've read like 5 of the plays, and they're fine. But I'm not the biggest fan in the world. I'm hoping I'll get a greater appreciation for him as I continue to read. Next up, I have The Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, again in a Barnes & Noble leather-bound edition. This one is falling apart. The cover has fallen off of it at this point and is only barely being held on. The problem with these leather-bound books is they're beautiful and they're cheap. They're only like $20 to buy for a nice, thick leather hardcover, which is less than you'll get from like any of the major other leather-bound publishers. But the spines are not that well attached, and I've had a couple of them fall apart on me. So I need to replace this one because I like to have Poe's stuff around, particularly around Halloween. Poe is one of those guys where I think his influence is greater than his actual work, and I do love his actual work, particularly his poetry. But I don't go back and read him that often because I think the stuff that he inspired is often better than what he actually did. But he's so inspirational in terms of the creativity of basically inventing the horror short story, basically inventing the science fiction short story, and basically inventing the detective short story with The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Very great author who everyone should read if they haven't before. And this is a nice edition, even though it's not as durable as I would like it to be. One more of these Barnes & Noble ones. I have the complete works of Lis Caroll, which has got this nice little rabbit on the front. I love Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. I think they're beautiful, imaginative, playful. The poetry is very fun. And the other thing I like about this edition, I actually haven't finished this because the last half of it is like some of the mathematics and logic puzzles and, more formal writing that Lis Caroll did, which I'm not that interested in. So I haven't ever finished it. But he wrote another novel after Through the Looking Glass called Sylvie and Bruno, which is super weird and very, very different than the rest of his work. It's worth checking out because it's so different. I kind of struggled to get through it a little bit because it's completely unlike the children's story. It's much more adult, but it has a lot of that kind of dipping into fairyland feel. It's a really weird book, but I like weird books. I like books that are just confusing and different and have weird creative choices in them. So I just wanted to show that as another of these Barnes & Noble leather bounds. I have like 3 or 4 more of these. The Sherlock Holmes one is also really good, but that's all I wanted to show because I want to get to other things. Next up, we have the None Such Dickens, David Copperfield. I love the None Such Dickens. They are, huge and unwieldy and heavy and impractical, but they're beautiful. And so, like, if you had the whole Dickens library, it would take up a whole shelf of this stuff. And I've kind of wanted to do that. I have Nicholas Nickleby in the same edition, but I can't find them anymore. They're all out of print now. They're like facsimiles of editions that came out in the 1900s, and they don't make them anymore. But you can get them used sometimes. And they have this nice little embossed leather thing on the front. David Copperfield was the first Dickens book I read as an adult. I read a few things like as a teenager or a child, and I didn't really vibe with them that well. I couldn't get into him. But I read David Copperfield a few years ago, and I really loved it. It's really funny. The characters are really well crafted and great. And it kind of launched me on a rediscovery of Dickens and reading a lot more of his stuff. And I've since read Nicholas Nickleby and Bleak House, and I love all those. So Dickens is great. And these are really cool editions if you can get your hand on them, even though they're way too large and heavy. Where to go next? Okay, I have some more classics over here, semi-classics. I have this Ayn Rand, We the Living. I know everyone hates Ayn Rand, but I actually quite like her. I am a libertarian myself, although not an objectivist. And their novel Atlas Shrugged was very influential on me when I was quite young. and I discovered it and thought it was cool. We the Living is her first novel, and it's much more romantic and much more Victor Hugo influenced. Her favorite writer was Victor Hugo, and my favorite writer is Victor Hugo, which we will get to shortly. But she was very influenced by him, and you can really see that in this one. But We the Living is kind of a nice, beautiful, romantic story of a girl trying to escape the Soviet Union. And I like her work. A lot of people say she's not a good novelist. I think she's a pretty good novelist, and I think the message of her stories is something that resonates with me, at least. So you're free to hate her if you want, but just know that she's on my bookshelf, and I think she's pretty good. Next up, speaking of people who are not very good, no, I'm just kidding. James Joyce, Ulysses. I have read this book twice, and I cannot get into it. I've tried really hard, and I feel James Joyce is one of those authors that I feel like as an educated, culturally literate person, I should really appreciate, and I can't do it, man. I've read Ulysses twice. I read Finnegan's Wake once. I read Dubliners, which I really liked. Finnegan's Wake I am fascinated by, but can't say I really like. Ulysses I've read twice, and it's my least favorite of the three. I can't get through it very easily, and I can't really like the characters or enjoy it. And so I know that's an unpopular opinion, and everyone else loves it. So good for you guys. I'm glad you get a lot out of it, but I haven't been able to get there. Maybe I'll read it again one day. But I wanted to point out that it's on my shelf, and I have read it twice. So I am trying. Other doorstoppers that I don't quite love as much as everyone else does. We have Marcel Proust. This translation calls it The Remembrance of Things Past. A more accurate translation would be In Search of Lost Time. Oh, this is actually volume 2. It's a 3-volume set, and I have all 3 volumes, and I have read all 3 volumes. I just accidentally grabbed volume 2 by mistake because I only wanted to show one of them. This is a beautiful edition. The silver paperback text. It's really nice. And the first part of In Search of Lost Time, I think, is pretty good and pretty interesting. There's that whole famous scene of being reminded by the tea and biscuits of his childhood and going back there, and it's very descriptive prose, and it's a lot of beauty in it, but it goes on forever and desperately needs an editor and gets kind of weird towards the end. I thought it was really pretentious and self-indulgent in a lot of places, and although I read the whole thing, I would not want to read it again. But it's one of those books that everyone says how great it is, so I thought I'd bring it up. Let's go a little lighter now. Over to Merry Old England. I have this P.G. Woodhouse book. I love these P.G. Woodhouse editions. They're little hardcovers with his dust jackets on. I have about 20 of them. There's a lot more that I don't have because they get a little samey after a while. And I started reading the Jeeves and Wooster stories, and I love the Jeeves and Wooster stories. And then I started reading the Blandings Castle stories, and I love the Blandings Castle stories. And then I started reading the school stories. And this is one of my favorite P.G. Woodhouse books. I could have picked any of them off the shelf. They're all great. But this one is called Mike and Smith. The P is silent in Smith. And it takes place at an English public school, which for those Americans watching would be a boarding school, what we would call essentially. And I just think they're hilarious. And I love that I have a real soft spot for that English boarding school kind of atmosphere and environment. And I think these are some of my favorite P.G. Woodhouse books, the ones that take place at English public schools, and they don't get talked about a lot. But I could recommend any of his books. They're all hilarious, they're all joyful, and I think they're fantastic. So you can always read more P.G. Woodhouse and have a good time. It's very, very British, and I like British things. And another very, very British thing that I love is 3 Men in a Boat, to Say Nothing of the Dog by Jerome K. Jerome. And this is a Barnes & Noble paperback, not a very high quality edition, but it's a hilarious short romp adventure where these 3 guys decide to go on a holiday boating on the Thames and everything goes wrong. It's really funnily written. I think it's the only thing the author really ever wrote, or the only thing of note that he wrote. But I go back to it a lot because it just makes me laugh out loud every time. It's a great kind of observational humor of when you go camping or when you go out into the wilderness, all the things that can go wrong to make your holiday more difficult. Really hilariously written. Very good. Next, we have another funny book, and I actually haven't finished this either. This is Gargantua and Pantagruel, and this is like 5 books in one volume. It's by Francois Rabelais, who was an early kind of, a late Renaissance, early modern period French writer and satirist. And this is about this giant named Gargantua, which is where we get the word gargantuan from. And there's a prequel about his son Pantagruel, and then there's several sequels. They're very ribald, they're very scatological. There's a lot of kind of gross out humor in it, but they're very funny. And there's a lot of satire of kind of the French society. And it's highly influential and very interesting writing. It's not the kind of thing you expect from someone writing like 400 years ago to be so funny. but they're really good. And I kind of got tired of them halfway through because I read the main ones, and then there's a bunch of sequels, and they got a little bit samey, so I never ended up finishing them. But they're the first one, Gargantua, or the first one I think is Pantagruel, and then the second one, Gargantua, are both well worth reading because they were very inspirational and very influential on a lot of humorists coming out of the early modern period. Next we have this edition of Earthly Powers by Anthony Burgess. I've been banging on about Anthony Burgess a lot lately because I discovered this in a used bookstore, I don't know, a couple years ago maybe now. And the only thing I knew by him was A Clockwork Orange. And I just saw this on the shelf and thought, I've only read A Clockwork Orange, but I liked it. I should pick this up and see if it's good. And I loved it. It's considered his greatest novel by many. I can't disagree. It's a panoramic tale of a old author and homosexual who is kind of looking back on his life throughout the entire 20th century. It's a beautiful story, covers all the major events in the 20th century, and it's about the relationship between him and his friend who's a member of the clergy, and it started the difference in the religious versus the secular worldview, but it encompasses so much. You can't really say it's about one thing because it's such a vast novel that kind of touches on so many aspects of the human experience. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It did not win, which I think is an injustice. Beautiful novel and highly recommended. Everything by Burgess I've read has been great, but this is maybe the best thing I've read by him. Love it. Okay, where else are we going? Let's go to some kind of science fiction, fantasy, mystery, genre fiction that I really love. I've talked about this book a lot, but I'm not going to stop talking about it because it's one of my very favorites, and it's probably my most recent discovery of one of my top 5 favorite novels of all time. It's Ice by Anna Kavan, or Cavan, or Cavan. I always say Kavan, so that's how I like to pronounce it, but I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. It's a very surreal, hallucinatory novel with an unreliable narrator taking place in this kind of post-nuclear winter, although it never really says nuclear winter, but it's this world where the ice is encroaching and it's getting colder and colder, and it's kind of one man's search for his lost love, but it's clear that there's something wrong with him, and it's unclear how much of it is in his head and how much of it is real. It's a fascinating book. Most of Anna's work that I've read has been in a similar vein, where it's kind of touches on mental illness and you can't really tell what's real or not because she struggled with that in her personal life. I loved it. A lot of people don't like it because it's really ambiguous what's actually going on, and if you need kind of more clarity in your novels, you're going to struggle with it. But it's one of my top 5 favorite novels of all time, and I've read it twice. It's unbelievable. Recommend. And I also want to say this Penguin series of science fiction cult classics from the UK. I always pick them up when I'm visiting the UK. I have about 10 of them now. They're all really highly well curated, well selected books. All the stuff I've read in the series has been pretty good. And I like the design of them a lot. I love the purple and the white and the kind of minimalist covers. So I really like those, and I have a lot of them. Speaking of Penguin books that have nice covers, The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. I discovered this book in 2008 when I was working at the Union Square Barnes & Noble in New York City. I was not working at the Barnes & Noble. I was working at the Virgin Megastore, but the Barnes & Noble was across the street from the Virgin Megastore. And I went in and I saw a display of these Penguin vintage covers, and I bought 2 of them. This was one of them. And I just thought the design was so cool. I had never heard of G.K. Chesterton. I'd never heard of this book, but I thought the design was awesome. And so I bought it and read it, and he became one of my very favorite authors. He's a masterful writer, master of prose, master of suspense and humor. He did poetry, he did apologetics because he was a devout Catholic, he did biography, he did detective stories, which are the Father Brown stories, which are pretty famous. But this is one of his most well-known novels, and it's kind of a mystery about an anarchist versus a policeman. It's great, it's fantastic, and I love this design of this penguin cover. They do a really good job of covers. Recommend everything by G.K. Chesterton. I've read most of what he's written at this point, and it's all so good. Next up is a science fiction classic that I had discovered by the Polish writer Stanislaw Lem. And I know about Stanislaw Lem because he wrote Solaris, which was made into 2 movies. So that's kind of how I knew about him. But I think I heard him his name on a Futurama commentary or something, and I looked into him. This is a collection of stories that are extremely humorous. Most of his work is not humorous, but this is about 2 kind of intergalactic constructors named Twirl and Klopausius who go around building things. And they're just hilarious, farcical stories. I love the way they're written. They make me laugh so hard. It's one of the few books I've read that really makes me laugh out loud every time I read it. It's just delightful. Solaris is much more serious, but if you want to read some kind of absurdist science fiction, it's slightly in the vein of like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The Siberiad by Stanislaw Lem is fantastic. Recommend. Speaking of science fiction short stories, my favorite short story writer for my whole life basically has been Philip K. Dick. And this is The Minority Report and Other Stories. It is one of a 4 or 5 volume series. I can't remember. It might be 5 volumes of his entire collected fiction. I've read them all. I just picked out this one to say hello. Minority Report is a great story and a great movie. So many movies have been made out of his short stories. Total Recall, Through a Scanner Darkly, Minority Report, Paycheck, Adjustment Bureau, Blade Runner, which is not based on a story but based on a novel. He's had been adapted endlessly, and he's so great. What I love about Philip K. Dick's stories is he has these great ideas. He has one like really clever idea and turns it into a 20-page story, and it's like they're like little Twilight Zone episodes. They got little twists at the end. They're endlessly creative. My favorite short story of all time is Paycheck, which the movie is a pale imitation of, not nearly as good, but that story is genius. But they're all so good, and there's so many wonderful stories in this collection. He's my favorite. Continuing in science fiction, we have Robert A. Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I love a lot of Heinlein's novels. I love the chances he's willing to take in his novels. He is willing to explore ideas that are slightly taboo. He's got a lot of weird sexual hang-ups that he talks about in a lot of them, but not in this novel. This novel is more about socio-political issues, and it's a favorite novel of anarchists like myself because it postulates a society on the moon with no government, and it's funny, and it's inspiring, and it kind of explores a lot of ideas about limited government or no government that I think are fascinating. And so this is one of my favorite Heinlein novels, but I've read a lot of his, and I like a lot of them very, very much. Let's move over to fantasy. Apart from Gormangas and The Lord of the Rings, The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson is one of my very favorite fantasy novels. I discovered him pretty recently maybe just a couple years ago, because I was interested in why we have the cliche of dwarves having Scottish accents. I wanted to know where that came from. And it apparently comes from one of his other books called 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, which was okay. But then I read this one, and this one blew me away. It's it's written in very much the same style as some of those like classic medieval epics or sagas. It's got a lot of those kind of things in it, but it's super entertaining. It's got, nonstop action, great characters, kind of violence and dark magic and fate and all that good stuff in it, prophecies and curses. It's just a beautiful, wonderful fantasy novel. And I kind of struggle with fantasy. A lot of fantasy novels I don't really like very much, but this one I really, really loved. And so his stuff is great. Let's just do this one next. This is a more modern fantasy novel, which I talked about recently, so you may have seen that. Mordieu by Alex Feby, a recent fantasy novel that I discovered a few months ago, and I just read the sequel to it as well. It's an antidote to my unease with modern fantasy novels. It's super creative. It lists a lot of, at the front of the book, he's got a list of all the fantastical elements that appear in the book. And it's just like, I love that kind of just endless creativity. It reminds me of things like the Wizard of Oz books, where you just, around every corner, there's some new fantastical thing. And it's not necessarily embedded within an internal logic. It's just like random, clever ideas of magical thoughts and magical creatures and stuff. This is about a young boy who has a magical spark within him inherited from his father that he's been encouraged not to use, but he lives in this dingy slum full of mud, and the mud is like magical and spawns these little like half alive little creatures that don't have any souls in them. And the whole thing is ruled over by a master who lives in a domain at the top of a glass road. Just beautiful. Really creative and unusual writing, very different from anything else you read recently. So I've read the first 2 in the series. The third one is coming out next year, and I can't wait to read that one too. That stack of books is going to fall over soon. Let's do Daphne du Maurier. Daphne du Maurier, one of my favorite writers ever. She's written great short stories. She's written great novels. And I have here the very first novel I ever reviewed on this channel. I haven't gone back to watch that review. It's probably terrible. Probably not that much more terrible than my reviews are now, but probably a little bit worse. And My Cousin Rachel was the first novel I read by her, and I loved it. It's kind of this great gothic romance that takes place on the moors of Cornwall. on the heaths of Cornwall, and there's all this uncertainty about whether something sinister is going on or whether it's all in the protagonist's head. It's a great one. And I also brought, for comparison, Rebecca, which is her most famous novel, famously adapted into a film by Alfred Hitchcock. And I love this Franklin Library leather-bound red copy of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. It's got illustrations in here, or at least in papers are illustrated. And it's just a beautiful copy. And Rebecca is, I'm not sure which novel I like best by Daphne du Maurier. They're all so good. But this is one of my favorites too. It's a beautiful novel. Again, about a woman who's kind of not quite sure if she's detecting something sinister going on or if it's all in her head. And it's very gothic. And again, it takes place in Cornwall because that's where Daphne du Maurier was from. And I love that setting and I love that kind of gothic vibe. Fantastic. We're going to get into more gothic stuff soon. Don't worry. We got some more horror here. A few horror books. Let's see. I have a bunch of horror short story collections. Robert Aikman, Dark Entries. I have another one of his called The Wine Dark Sea. Robert Aikman has become one of my favorite horror short story writers. His stories are just so subtle, and they're like just that sense of unease where you don't really know what's going on. Doesn't hit you over the head. They don't have big Twilight Zone twists at the end. It's just like the setting. There's something a little bit off, and you're just dropped into this world where you're like, I just feel creepy. I just feel something uneasy about here. He's got such a nice touch, and so I love his stuff for that. Then we have some Lovecraftian influences here. I like Lovecraft a lot, but I think I like the people who influenced him better than I like him himself. So, for example, I have the Penguin Classics edition of Algernon Blackwood's stories, Ancient Sorceries, and Other Weird Stories. His most famous story is The Willows. Ancient Sorceries was adapted into a movie called Cat People, but Algernon Blackwood was an influence on Lovecraft. And he wrote nature horror. All of his stories kind of basically involve characters going out into nature and being afraid of the evil spirits they find there, or just the spirit of nature itself, just kind of the awesome power of the natural world. Really cool stuff. I like his work a lot. Also, in the same vein, we have The Three Impostors by Arthur Machen. Arthur Machen's maybe my favorite Lovecraftian influencer. He was a Welsh writer who was obsessed with fairies. And he wrote The Great God Pan as sort of his most famous story. The Three Impostors is a novel that sort of involves nested stories within it. They're really clever, very Welsh. I'm obsessed with things Welsh, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. But I love his work, and I love kind of the pagan aspect of his work, doing with The Great God Pan and stuff. I think that's all fantastic. And this is, I think, Call of Cthulhu Press. Yeah, Call of Cthulhu Press. So it's all based on Lovecraftian fiction. And I have two of these. The other one I have is the Great God Pan. Another influence on Lovecraft was, of course, The King in Yellow by Robert Chambers. This is the Dover edition. I used to be really obsessed with Dover books. I think they're a great publisher. They put out a lot of really interesting stuff, and I bought a lot of their works, but I haven't in a while. The King in Yellow is a set of linked short stories that have to do with this kind of forbidden play called The King in Yellow, which you read it makes you go insane. And this has been super influential on a lot of future writers as well. They've incorporated this idea of The King in Yellow into lots of different things. It's very cosmic horror. It's very kind of like Necronomicon. You read it, it makes you go crazy. They're great, and they're really strange and surreal kind of stories in a lot of ways. I really recommend this collection by Robert W. Chambers. And then we also have one more in this category, Lord Dunsany Wonder Tales. Lord Dunsany is more of fantasy than horror for the most part, but his tales are so great. They're like little miniatures. They're very short, but they drop you into these worlds, these fantastic worlds where, you kind of understand where you are immediately, but they're full of weird and wonderful things. And it's like the classic tropes of fantasy, like the shop that sells magical items that disappears the next time you try to find it, like that kind of thing. Or like goblins, worlds full of goblins, or fairies, or just little magical things. There's a great story in here about some brothers who have managed to get a chessboard that allows them to always win, and they're trying to push the magic to its limits by handicapping themselves by removing half the pieces before they play, and they always win. Just weird little things like that. Super creative, super beautiful, fantastic little stories, and very short. One of my favorite short stories of all time, called Chubu and Sheemish, is about two kind of minor gods that are embodied in these little wooden idols in this primitive hut that are sort of warring with each other. It's a really funny story and really great. Love George Unsaney stuff. It's unlike anything else that you read. And then I have one more short story collection here, which is Wordsworth Editions, a paperback of The Drug and Other Stories by Aleister Crowley. Now, I've talked about this. This is actually my most viewed video I've ever talked about, is about this book. So go watch that video and give it some more views. But this is not a great book in the sense that Aleister Crowley, you trained me to say Crowley because everyone gave me such a hard time for saying Crowley. But it's not a great book. His short story writing is not his best writing. But there is some interesting kind of Kabbalistic symbolism in here if you're into the Kabbalah and other Crowley's writings on magic. But I wanted to bring it up just because I'm a big fan of Aleister Crowley's writings on magic, and when I do my bookshelf tour on books on magic and the occult, he will feature heavily. But I just am a huge fan of him, and I think some of his writing is really interesting, even though I wouldn't rate him highly as a short story writer or a poet. Going back to some classic fantasy. Again, this is more of a pre-Tolkien, sort of Tolkien influence on fantasy. The Worm Oroboros by E.R. Edison. This is a Barnes & Noble paperback. Fascinating little fantasy story, kind of pre-modern fantasy. It's kind of got these warring kingdoms. Again, it's very saga-like. It's very ornate in the way the prose is written. It's not as entertaining as some of the later fantasy because it's written in a much more kind of authentic, antiquated style, and it's not so designed to be like an action story. But the world building in it is really beautiful, and it gave a lot of ideas to later fantasy writers. So if you're interested in early fantasy, I think this is a really cool book to read, The Worm Oroboros. We have some Gothic fiction here. I love Gothic fiction. We have Melmoth the Wanderer in this big hardcover book, which I think is like a basically self-published print-on-demand book, but it's nicely designed. Usually those are not very nicely designed, but I like this one. It's got illustrations. Melmoth the Wanderer is super weird, very influential Gothic book about these kind of linked stories where people are telling about this immortal wanderer who apparently sold his soul to the devil for immortality, and they... it starts with like a descendant family member of his dying in bed, and he shows up at the foot of their castle to say something to them, and then he disappears, and there's like stories of following him through the ages and people who have encountered him and the things that his appearance has caused to happen. I found it really interesting. It's a little bit hard to read, but it's definitely unlike other books, and it's really cool. And then we have the gruesome, sensational The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis. This is a Dover Thrift edition. It's weird how you can remember like very specific things about certain books. So like I picked this book up when I was in grad school, and there was a little shop across the street from where I had classes. I didn't have a lot of money at the time, but there was a little shop that sold Dover Thrift editions in a big rack, and they were like $1 to $2 per book. And so I would go over there all the time and just buy whatever they had because I liked Dover editions, and they had a lot of interesting books. I think I got Heart of Darkness there and a few other things. And I really remember seeing this one and thinking, well, that looks cool. I didn't know much about it. And I bought it for like $2 and read it. And it's great. It's about a monk who's kind of tempted by this woman, and he's tempted by the devil. And it's very sensational. There's a lot of sexual stuff in it. There's a lot of devil worship-y kind of stuff in it. There's a lot of, casting aspersions on the clergy, which was forbidden at the time, but it was like a huge bestseller at the time when it came out because it was so, so sensational. So like an NC, not really NC-17, but like it was the R-rated book of its time, and it was condemned by a lot of people as trash, but it's really influential on later Gothic romances, and I think it's a ripping good read. I really like it. Speaking of kind of sensational books, we have a few more here. I brought out American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. We're kind of moving into more modern and experimental books here. American Psycho is a very upsetting book to read. It's incredibly violent. It's got a lot of sexual violence in it, but it's a wonderful, wonderful, fascinating book because it's basically, in my mind, it's all about someone who's kind of lost his soul, someone who's sold out to work at a big finance corporation and has nothing really meaningful in his life to live for. And because his day-to-day is so empty and so concerned with like fashion and business cards and money and getting a reservation at the best restaurant, that he has no meaning in his life. And as such, he fantasizes about committing horrible acts of violence just so he feels something. That's my interpretation of the book. The movie has a little bit of a different interpretation of it, but I think the way the book is written is completely fascinating and genius. There's all little like Easter eggs in there, like the fashion combinations that They write for that. Probably Ellis writes for the main character. If you can actually look up those clothing items and see that they don't make any sense together, the information that he has, where he goes on long diatribes about like Huey Lewis and the News, all his information is wrong. He gets all the details wrong all the time, which shows that he has a very shallow surface level understanding of things. I found it a fascinating book. It's very dark and very R-rated, but it's a wonderful book. I just think it's unlike anything else. It's great. And then I have this book, which it's not one of my favorite books. It's called Negative Space by B.R. Yeager, but I pulled it out because it's by this press called Apocalypse Party Press. And after I bought this book, I started buying other Apocalypse Party Press books because I think that they publish really interesting things. And their stuff is kind of modern horror. This one's about a town where a bunch of teenagers are taking this new experimental drug that's basically killing them, but also summoning demons at the same time. It's really dark. It's really messed up, but it's very experimental and very cool in that sense. And I wouldn't say I love this book, but I thought it was interesting, and I think the stuff that Apocalypse Party Press is doing is really interesting. So I wanted to pull it out just to talk about that. There's a few other books I've read by them, and they're all very different than other stuff you read. This one's a little bit less different, but I wanted to talk about it because he's one of my favorite writers. It is Clive Barker, The Hellbound Heart, which was famously adapted into Hellraiser by Clive Barker himself. He had wrote the screenplay and directed it. This is a very short novel, but I think it's beautiful and I think it's great. And it's a great example of what TV tropes call blue and orange morality, where someone is seeking the extremes of sensation, the extremes of pleasure, where pleasure bends around in a horseshoe to interact with pain, and you can't tell the difference between them. And they contact these extra-dimensional beings called Cenobites, who are basically explorers in the region of this extreme experience. And they're not good or evil. This is just what they do. And what they do is basically torture to humans, but it's what this guy asked for. Fascinating little book. And I think it's my favorite thing by Clive Barker, but it inspired me to go on and read like another 10 books by him, and all of his stuff is great. Another very well-renowned horror writer, Stephen King. I have The Colorado Kid here. I read Stephen King a lot as a teenager, and then I got kind of fed up with Stephen King because I read a few of his lesser books that are not so good, and I thought, I'm done with this guy. I don't want to read him anymore. And then a friend of mine said, we were talking about Stephen King, and I mentioned this, and a friend of mine said, you should read The Colorado Kid. It'll win you back over. And it did. It's a short little mystery book. It's published by this Hard Case Crimes mystery imprint, which I love. All their stuff is like these hard-boiled, old school detective stories that are wonderful, like James M. Cain and people like that. But Stephen King was published by them. And this is a mystery without a resolution, which is what's so great about it. It's very unusual in fiction for doing that, but it's very true to life in that you never really get a resolution to what's going on. And I think that's fantastic because there's so many tidy little bow mysteries that people like to write, and that people complain about if they're not wrapped up in a tidy little bow. And having something that's a little bit more ambiguous is a lot of fun. So I really like The Colorado Kid. Another one of my favorite modern writers is Neil Gaiman, and I have Anansi Boys here. This is not my favorite Neil Gaiman book, but it's the one I had close at hand. I really loved The Graveyard Book. I like Stardust. I like American Gods. Anansi Boys is really good too, but Neil Gaiman is one of those guys who I think is just a great, great storyteller. He is very steeped in mythology and folklore, which is all the stuff I love as well. He loves kind of stories about demons and stories about gods, and he loves, this is a book about gods. He loves kind of spooky things. He loves to talk about ghosts and vampires and werewolves and stuff, but he does it in a playful way. He's very funny. And I love his work. So Anansi Boys, not my favorite book by him, but I wanted to have him represented on this list because he's such just a beautiful storyteller, and I love all of his work. Someone a little less beautiful in their storytelling, Chuck Palahniuk, or I forget how people in the comments told me to say it, but I'm saying Palahniuk. Haunted is a harrowing story about people who are basically in a reality show type house where they have a quest for fame and notoriety, and these people with their kind of backstories, they all go to a writer's retreat in this house together to write their stories, and you learn about their backstories in a series of linked short stories, and they're all just like over the top, violent, gruesome, harrowing, and it's a very upsetting book to read. It's a book I'll probably never read again. It can be seen as comedy because it's so over the top. Sometimes when you push something to that extreme, it's so over the top, but I like this book because I like that it pushes the boundaries and it tries to do something that no one else is doing. In the introduction or in the afterword, I forget, the author talks about how you can't do this stuff in any other medium apart from literature. You can't put this in a movie, it would be censored. You can't put it on YouTube, it would be censored. You can't put it on a CD or a record, it would be censored. You have to put it, you couldn't put it in a play, it would be censored. You can put it in a book and sit on the shelf, and it's kind of a standing up for free speech sort of book, which I really appreciate and really love. Even though this book was not really for me, it's a little too extreme for my taste. I appreciate what the author is trying to do with it, and I thought it was cool. It's also, if you go into any used bookstore, you're likely to see 10 to 12 copies of this on the shelf, because everyone who reads it immediately wants to get it out of their house because it's so extreme. One more modern horror book that I loved. It's not often I find a modern horror book that I love, and it's sort of crossover fantasy horror. The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. I just kind of randomly picked this up, and this is just a great, modern horror book. Again, it's a little bit extreme at parts, but it's a totally gripping narrative, and it's about these people who study at this library and have these different catalogs of abilities that they have. I actually don't remember the plot that well, so I'm not going to go into it any further. It was a long time ago when I read it, but I remember just being gripped by it. It's one of those books you can't put down, and I just wanted to highlight it because it's a ripping good read. If you're into more modern horror / fantasy, this is a lot of fun. Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. I think he's written another book since then, which I'll have to check out. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is sort of my miscellaneous pile that's left. There's only a few books left. Miscellaneous things. Victor Hugo is my favorite novelist, apart from Tolkien. I think all his novels are beautiful. And for a while, I was trying to learn French. And I bought this copy of The Toilers of the Sea, or in French, Les Travailleurs de la Mer. And it's kind of falling apart. I ordered this online, and the spine is coming off of it. But it's a French copy and kind of leather bound of The Toilers of the Sea. The Toilers of the Sea is a beautiful story of a man who is trying to win his love on one of the Channel Islands, where Victor Hugo was exiled for the last part of his life because of his political opinions. And beautiful landscape descriptions of the island, beautiful descriptions of the sea. I'm a big fan of the sea. And an amazing, emotional hero, a great love story in a sense, although the woman in the book is totally unworthy of the amazing hero in this. That's the only downside about it, but it's one of my favorites by him, and it's very emotional, and it will make you cry. So I wanted to point out this, and have this nice, even though it's falling apart, it's kind of a nice edition of this Toilers of the Sea in French, which I never got through in French, by the way. I never got good enough to read the entire book, although I read a couple chapters. And then I kind of gave up on French. And when I gave up on French, I switched over to Welsh. And the first book I ever read in Welsh is this one, which is called Llyfr Glas Nebo. And I actually attempted to review this book in Welsh on my channel with mixed results. It's quite short, and it's written as a series of diary entries by a mother and a son who are describing after the end of the apocalypse, when basically everyone has died off because of something called the event. And it goes back and forth between their points of view. And it's written in a very informal style because the son is a child, and so he doesn't write like a formal writer would. So there's a lot of misspellings, and there's a lot of kind of contractions and weird phrasings, which makes it quite challenging for the learner of Welsh to read. I've read a couple other Welsh books since then, but I love Welsh. It's such a beautiful language, and this is the first book I read. It's quite highly reviewed. I enjoyed it. I don't know that I would have enjoyed it that much in English, but because I was working through the language, I thought it was a lot of fun. And I just wanted to kind of brag on myself a little bit and say, hey, I read a book in a foreign language. Look at me. So that was fun. This book, the only reason I have this book in the pile is because I like the edition I have of it. It's The Wizard by H. Rider Haggard. I found this in a used bookstore. It's a first American printing. It's like from 1890, so it's quite old. And I think it's a beautiful edition. And I like having, I'm not a book collector in the sense where I try to get rare editions or early editions. I'm a book collector in the sense that I like good books and I like to have them. But I just saw this and it was cheap, and I thought I'll pick it up. And it's a story. H. Rider Haggard is the adventure writer who wrote King Solomon's Mines and He was inspired by Treasure Island. He thought, if Robert Louis Stevenson can do it, I can do it. And those are great books. I really like King Solomon's Mines. This one's a little less great. It's about someone who goes to a Christian missionary who goes to Africa and basically has a magic contest with their shaman, their holy man. And because the African tribe says, you're trying to bring Christianity to us, but why should we believe in your God? If your God's so good, he should be able to beat our God in a fight. So he's like, okay, that's fair enough. Let's do it. and they have a competition about that. So it's a little bit of a colonial novel, which some people have a problem with, but I thought it was an interesting read, if not my favorite by him. But I just wanted to show off the edition a little bit. What else do I have here? Oh, this is interesting. So I was really into surrealism for a while, and I bought this anthology of black humor by André Breton. André Breton was one of the major surrealist figures in France, and I think surrealism is really interesting, and this is the anthology of black humor. It's a collection of essays, short stories, poetry by a variety of authors that are kind of surrealist, but also very dark, darkly humorous. It has Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal in here. There's a lot of satire, and there's a lot of fun stuff. There's a poem I particularly like by a poet who I don't remember his name, and I couldn't find any other information else about him. Like, he hasn't ever done anything else. But it's a poem about someone basically starving, and it says, if you get hungry enough, you can eat your own hand at the end. I think it's a harrowing but very interesting poem. And there's a lot of interesting poetry in here, and a lot of interesting short stories and essays. Black humor, if you're into kind of the darker side of stuff, and if you're into surrealism, it's a really cool volume. And it's got a lot of different authors from different time periods and different countries in here. The Jonathan Swift one is particularly funny. Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is my favorite TV series. I think it's the best thing that's ever been on TV. And there's a couple companion volumes to it. I wanted to grab The Secret History of Twin Peaks, which I don't know where it is. I don't have a copy of it on hand. But this is another one called The Final Dossier, which came out after the most recent 2016, I think, season of Twin Peaks, which aired on Netflix. And this is just like additional material to help you understand the weird and mystical world of the town of Twin Peaks, written by Mark Frost, who is a co-writer of the series. It's great. And if you haven't watched Twin Peaks, you must. And if you have watched Twin Peaks, I can say pick up The Secret History of Twin Peaks and The Final Dossier, and it will make the series so much more enjoyable and give you so much more additional information about the characters, their backstories, what happened to them after the events of the series, and so on and so on. A lot of extra mystery in there. Mark Frost is a really underrated writer. He's really great. Like, as much as I love David Lynch, I think Mark Frost was a key component of making that series beautiful and great. And then the last thing I have for you is not a book in all, but a magazine. And this is purely, again, bragging on myself and selfishly showing. This is the Andromeda Spaceways In-Flight magazine, issue number 56 from May 2012. And this is the only magazine. It's an Australian science fiction magazine. This is the only magazine that I have ever sold a short story to. So issue 56 contains a short story I wrote called The Zombie Apocalypse is Thirsty Business, which is about an alcoholic man who, on having the world taken over by zombies and all civilization shut down, sees it as an opportunity to go into his local liquor store and try to drink everything on the shelves before it's too late. It's a humorous little story that I wrote, and it was the only one I ever managed to sell. I got 20 Australian dollars for it, which is nothing, but I'm very proud of it, and I'm proud that it got published in this magazine, so I wanted to show it off in my bookshelf tour because I have a copy of it sitting around. It's now 12 years old, but it's something that I did that I think is pretty worth talking about. So that's 50 things that I have on my bookshelf that I wanted to talk about. I hope you found that interesting. If you have other stuff you would like to hear about, please let me know. I'm definitely going to do an occult one at some point. I'll probably do a political philosophy one at some point because I have big collections of those. Do a top 50 of each of those as well. And that's all I've got for today. I'd love to hear your comments on the books that I brought to show you, and anything else you have to say. If you enjoyed this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and check back next week for another book review. Until then, I've been your host, Logan Albright. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.